All right, let's dive into one of the biggest, oldest mysteries there is: consciousness. I mean, for basically all of human history, we've been asking ourselves, what are we really? In this explainer, we're going to dig into a pretty radical new theory from James Cooke's book, The Dawn of Mind. And it might just connect the dots between what science tells us and what spirituality has been saying for centuries. So it really all boils down to this one question. And depending on who you ask, you get two completely different, polar opposite answers. So on one side, you've got science, which basically says we're incredibly complex biological machines, just a bunch of atoms and particles following the laws of physics. But then, on the other side, you have spirituality, telling us we're something more, a conscious soul, a piece of the divine with some grand purpose. And these two ideas, they just don't seem to fit together at all, leaving this massive gap in how we see ourselves. And this gap really exists for one simple reason. We can look at ourselves from two totally different viewpoints. There's the objective world out there, the world of things we can measure and study. And then there's the subjective world in here, our private, internal world of thoughts and feelings. You probably remember a perfect and honestly hilarious example of this. Back in 2015, a picture of a dress completely took over the internet. People were losing their minds arguing about whether it was black and blue or white and gold. And this is where it gets really fascinating. Objectively, the dress is just reflecting light waves in a specific, measurable way. That's a fact. But the color you actually see, that's a purely subjective experience happening inside your head, and only your head. It shows us that something we take for granted as a fact about the world is actually a private internal event. So, to try and solve this mystery, modern science has pretty much put all its eggs in one basket: the objective world. Specifically, the 3-pound lump of tissue between your ears, the brain. This whole approach is captured perfectly by the Nobel Prize winner Francis Crick. He called it the astonishing hypothesis, and it basically says that everything about you, all your hopes, your dreams, your love, your sadness, it's all just the chattering of neurons in your brain, nothing more. This idea is called reductionism, and it's a pretty simple concept at its core. If you want to understand something complicated, you just break it down into its smallest, simplest parts. The thinking is, if you understand how all the little bits work, you'll understand the whole thing. Let's use an example. Imagine smelling fresh-baked cookies. Using reductionism, science can map out that entire physical process perfectly. Molecules from the cookie go up your nose, trigger neurons to fire, which sends signals to your brain, which then sends signals to your muscles, so you reach out and grab one. Every single step is accounted for. But wait, here's the billion-dollar question. In that whole perfectly detailed objective description, where is the feeling? Where is that warm, comforting, delicious experience of the smell? It's just gone. It's completely missing from the scientific picture. And that leads us to a totally different approach. What if we've been starting in the wrong place all along? Instead of looking at the brain from the outside, what if we start with the experience itself, from the inside? This is exactly what mystics and spiritual seekers have been doing for thousands of years. They've been turning their attention inward to explore the nature of awareness itself, trying to find the reality that exists underneath all our thoughts and labels. In fact, the author of our source, James Cooke, actually had this happen to him out of the blue. He was in the middle of this intense anxiety, and then suddenly, his thoughts just stopped. And what was left wasn't some scary void. It was this incredible sense of clarity and peace, like waking up from a long, noisy dream. So this kind of inner looking reveals something profound. And there's a great way to think about it. When you look at the Mona Lisa, what do you see? A woman, right? But if you look at a Van Gogh painting, you're super aware that you're just looking at thick globs of paint. Now here's the trick. If you go back and look at the Mona Lisa again, you can now choose to see it as just splotches of paint too. The woman isn't really there on the canvas. She's a construction your mind creates. And the big insight here is that maybe our whole sense of a world made of separate things is just like that painting, a mental construct. So here we are. Science looks at the brain and can't find experience. Mysticism looks inward and says reality is a mental construct. How in the world do you bring those two together? Well, the proposed answer is actually really beautiful and surprisingly simple. The theory is called biopsychism, and the core idea is this. Consciousness isn't some fancy feature that only showed up late in the game with humans and our big, complicated brains. No, consciousness is a fundamental property of life itself.
Okay, stick with me here, because this is the key. The entire universe is constantly moving towards disorder and decay. Scientists call it entropy. Everything falls apart. But life is the one thing that actively fights back against this. It works 24/7 to hold itself together. And to do that, to survive, any living thing absolutely has to create an internal model of its environment so it can find food and avoid danger. And here's the punchline. That ongoing process of building an inner model of the outer world, that's what conscious experience is. And this is the crucial distinction. A rock doesn't care about disorder, it just erodes. It doesn't need to model the world. But a living thing, even a tiny bacterium, has to. It has to build an inner world to navigate the outer one just to stay alive. So from this point of view, consciousness isn't some weird fluke. It's the essential survival tool that popped into existence the moment life itself did. Okay, so let's say we roll with this. Consciousness is a basic property of all life. So what? Why does this actually matter in the real world? Well, the implications are huge. It basically changes everything. For starters, that hard problem of how dead stuff creates feelings, it just vanishes because life was never dead stuff to begin with. It also forces us to drop this idea that humans are somehow uniquely special. We're not these lonely, conscious minds trapped in a dead mechanical universe anymore. Instead, we become living, feeling parts of a gigantic, conscious web of life.
And this is not just some feel-good philosophical idea. It has profound, real-world consequences for how we live. It completely reframes our relationship with our planet. We're no longer the managers of a dead resource that we can just exploit. We are participants, members of a family related to every other living thing in a vast conscious biosphere.
And this whole idea leaves us with a final, really powerful question to think about. The author calls every living thing a living mirror, a unique way for the universe to see and experience itself. So if that's true, if consciousness is looking back at you from every tree, every animal, every blade of grass, what does the world look like to you now?